Hey students, it is Miss Stokes, and here is your video companion for the assessment called Shaping Arguments, Induction, Deduction, Claims, and Toulmin Model. So this video will go over everything that you need to know for this assessment, and we are going to start with Objective 1, Identifying the Type of Claim. Awesome, so let's take a look at this question. This question you'll actually see in the diagnostic for the assessment. And so I'm just going to kind of talk you through the different diagnostic questions to help you be better successful when you take the actual assessment. So for the first objective, it asks for you to look at a quote from a larger argument and identify if the type of argumentation occurring is based upon fact, or is a factual argument, a policy argument, or a value argument. And so for this example here, we don't really need to read the whole thing. We just need to read the bolded part. It reads, there have been legislative successes in recent years in some places, including Alabama and Nevada. So this is a value argument because of this word right here. There have been legislative successes. So arguments of value essentially argue whether something is good or bad, successful or a failure, strong or weak. It's essentially passing value upon something, and that's a value argument. So you want to be looking for words that indicate the worth or value of something is being determined in the argument. Now, if this was going to be a policy argument, a lot of students think that this is policy because it simply says legislative, but the topic has nothing to do with whether it's a fact, policy, or value argument. It has to do with how the argument's working. So if this was actually a policy argument, it would say something along the lines of the legislators in Alabama and Nevada must do these actions because of this. So policy makes demands about some type of process or rule or action. So again, value determines something's worth. Policy makes a demand as to something that should happen. That's policy. Now, if this was a fact argument, this would say something along the lines of the legislation that occurred in Alabama and Nevada was blank. It simply states something that can be proven as true or false. And what a lot of students struggle with the fact argument is that if they read something that's clearly false, they'll say, oh, well, that can't be fact. That's factually untrue. But a fact argument has nothing to do with whether it's true or false. It's simply about how the argument works. If something is stating something as though it is the truth and can be proven true or false, it is a factual argument. It doesn't necessarily need to be true or false because you can have a factual argument that also has a fallacy in it. So hopefully that makes sense, but if not, don't worry. We're going to look at one more example. All right, so here is our second example, and it reads, Leonardo DiCaprio is the best leading man in Hollywood. I know some of you students out there are going to particularly like this one. So let's consider what it is. Again, this is a value statement because it says best leading man in Hollywood. It's passing value upon Leonardo DiCaprio. Now, if this was a policy statement, it would say something along the lines of Leonardo DiCaprio's foundation should do this, this, and this in order to save the environment. So it's making policy suggestions as to things that should occur. If this was a factual statement, it would say something along the lines of Leonardo DiCaprio was born in Wisconsin in 1947. Now, this is obviously not true. That does not matter. What matters about a fact argument is that it's stating something as though it is a truth, and it can be proven as true or false with research. So that is the difference between a fact, value, and policy argument. All right, so now let's move on to Objective 2 of the assessment, which is inductive and deductive reasoning. Let's talk about what each of these are. Awesome, so let's first talk about inductive reasoning. So when you do inductive reasoning, you're doing it based upon patterns of observations or data. So the key to inductive reasoning are observations and data. So for instance, we see 3, 6, 9, 12. based upon this pattern, we can inductively determine that the next number will be 15 because we have a series of data, and based upon that data, we can determine an outcome. And so inductive reasoning, when actually put into practice, can look like a bunch of things. At its most simplest form, it can just be looking outside the window and saying, it's sunny out. There are birds flying around. Oh, look at those children over there wearing t-shirts and shorts and sandals and playing volleyball. It must be a beautiful summer day. So the inductive reasoning that occurs there takes in these different observations and draws a conclusion. So based upon the observations, the conclusion was drawn, it's a beautiful sunny day. Now, the problem with inductive reasoning is that at any moment you can have a new piece of data come in that changes everything. So for instance, if I'm looking out this window and I see all those things, but then I spot a thermometer that says it's 30 degrees outside, I might all of a sudden change my conclusion. It is not, in fact, a beautiful summer day. Those children playing volleyball in shorts and t-shirts are making bad life decisions and are going to get the flu. And that would be my new conclusion, that it is a cold day and people are making bad decisions about their clothing. And so inductive reasoning can change once more data comes in. And so inductive reasoning is never certain. Another example of inductive reasoning happens a lot in labs. So you'll get pages and pages of data based upon studies, and based upon that data, you draw a conclusion, and a scientifically inductive conclusion. And again, just like with the last example, you could then get new data that comes in and changes everything that you thought you knew about your previous conclusion. And so inductive reasoning is going to, when you see it on this assessment and in real life, is going to be a list of observations or a list of data that you can then draw a conclusion based upon. Awesome. So now let's talk about deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning operates in a very different way from inductive reasoning. The form of logic is a totally different approach. And so here we have a statement, all dolphins are mammals. This would be considered A, the major premise, okay? All dolphins are mammals. Then we have B, the minor premise, all mammals have kidneys. Then if we take the major premise and the minor premise, we can determine C, the conclusion. All dolphins have kidneys. And this is how deductive reasoning works. And as it's showing over here, it's the transitive property. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So for those of you who remember the transitive property from math, that might help you remember what the deductive reasoning is. And so deductive reasoning is strictly reliant upon major, minor, premises, and then the conclusion. Now, the problem with deductive reasoning, it's supposed to be considered a flawless form of argumentation. If you can have a certain major and a certain minor premise, you will always get a true conclusion. However, there are fallacies and biases and confusions. And because of that, if a major or minor premise is incorrect because of one of those problems, the conclusion will be incorrect. So my favorite example is if the major premise is women cannot drive, rude. And the minor premise is Miss Stokes is a woman. That's true. Then the conclusion was Miss Stokes can't drive. That is untrue. I'm a very conscientious driver. And therefore, the conclusion ends up being incorrect because the major premise that women cannot drive is biased and rude. And therefore, it leads to an incorrect conclusion. And so that's how deductive reasoning works. All right. Excellent. Let's move to our third and final objective, which is the Toulmin model. Now, the Toulmin model developed in order to allow for what people are already doing, which is more complex argumentation that isn't so rigid. So for instance, if you think of deductive reasoning where you're having a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion, that doesn't allow for a lot of wiggle room. And so what we have here is the Toulmin model. And so the Toulmin model has different elements that allow for more complex argumentation. We have the claim, the evidence, the backing, the assumption and warrant, the reservation, and the qualifier. And so each of those things allow for much more complex argumentation. And so let's look at this example and see how it gives us a lot more room for complexity than deductive reasoning does. And so this example reads, because the fast food industry continues to grow and is not going away, even those of us who support slow food should invest in it, since investing has the power to persuade businesses to change. And so when we look at this one, this statement right here, those of us who support slow foods should invest in it, is the claim. So that's the central argument to this entire statement. This is what the author is trying to prove. And so when you're trying to figure out what is what in the Toulmin model, it's a good idea to find the claim first, because that will allow for you to identify all of these other items in kind of like orientation of the claim. And so what we have preceding the central claim is because the fast food industry continues to grow and is not going away. So this is the evidence. These are the observations or the data. That should sound familiar. These are the observations or the data that the speaker is using in order to determine their claim. A real giveaway for what the evidence is if it starts with the word because, or if you could add the word because before it and it still makes sense. So the because initiates the evidence, but the real way to know if it's evidence is if it is an observation or some type of data that supports the primary claim. Excellent. So now we have something following the claim that says, since investing has the power to persuade businesses to change. So this would be the assumption or warrant. And the way that we know it's the assumption or warrant is it sounds very much like a claim, but it's not actually what the speaker is going to argue about. Instead, it's something that they're assuming that they and their reader are going to agree upon, and that is just going to be taken as an assumption, as a given in their argument, so that their claim can then be better supported. And so the way to think about the assumption or warrant is kind of a secondary claim that we're assuming to be true, and the claim is what's actually going to be argued. Now, a problem within an argument is if the author makes an assumption that readers don't actually assume to be true. If you make an assumption and assume people agree with you and then don't go to have any evidence to support it, then your entire argument's undermined. So you got to make sure that your assumption is in fact a given. Otherwise, people are not going to believe the claim. Now, there is a solution for this. If you have an assumption or warrant that you are worried that people aren't going to be like, oh yeah, obviously that's true, you can add in something called backing. So backing is further evidence that you provide to support your assumption to make it even more persuasive as being an obvious statement. So the difference between the claim and the assumption is that the claim is what's actually going to be proven as true, and the assumption the author just assumes people will agree with. The evidence is what is used to support the claim. It's the observations, the data used to support the claim, and the backing similarly are observations and data, but their purpose is to support the assumption. So when you're trying to determine the difference between the evidence or the backing, try to determine which is being supported, the claim or the assumption. So we also have two other items to talk about for a Toulmin model, the reservation and qualifier. So reservation, we don't have an example in here, but a reservation would say something along the lines of unless this happens. So the reservation essentially addresses any holes in an argument, any opposition to an argument, any concessions to an argument. So for instance, even those of us who support slow food should invest in it unless you are super broke, would be the reservation, the unless you are super broke. So the reservation is essentially, my argument is true all the time. Oh, except in this instance. And so the reservation are exceptions to your claim that you are acknowledging up front so as to make concessions to your opposition and therefore actually make your argument stronger. Then we have the qualifier. Qualifiers should be super easy to determine. They're just going to be 1, 2, maybe 3 words. And they can be like sometimes, always, or never.